inviting me, and thank you for coming. So I'm Shigehiro Oishi, I'm a psychologist, and oh yeah, I'm supposed to just introduce myself. So my topic is inequality and perhaps unhappiness rather than happiness. So when I heard about this conference, my first thought was actually President Trump, because this sounded like how to make America great again. Because, right, why America suffering? Inequality, opportunities. And back in 2016, when I heard this Make America Great Again message, I thought, wow, it's catchy. It's much better than the other one, which was, anyone remember? Stronger Together. I love Hillary, but when I first heard that message, I thought she should have talked to psychologists, because the psychologist would have said, that's not going to work for America, because Americans think that they're stronger alone rather than stronger together. Anyway, for a long time, I didn't quite understand what President or then the candidate Trump meant by Make America Great Again. And it was revealing that during his inauguration address, he sort of made it a little bit more explicit. So he said, together we'll make America strong again, wealthy again, proud again, safe again, and then, yes, together we'll make America great again. So for him, it seems like the great society is a strong society, and perhaps he meant military strength, and also the wealth and the safety and so forth. But when you think about it, the military spendings and so forth, America is still by far the strongest military. And in terms of wealth, well, we have very high GDP per capita. The stock market is highest ever, so it seems we're doing pretty well. In terms of pride, well, Americans are always very proud, so there's no problem about that. In terms of safety, well, if you were here in New York City in 1980s, you know it's much safer now. So, to a person like me, this didn't make any sense. And I started to think, so then what is a great society? Of course, since Plato's Republic, many philosophers thought about what great societies is. They debated about it. Political scientists thought about it. Sociologists thought about it. But for me, happiness researcher, I think the great society is a society where its citizens are happy, satisfied with their lives, find their lives to be meaningful. So what I did essentially is to look at the time when Americans were happiest. Luckily, General Social Survey conducted research since 1972, and they had happiness items, so we know more or less when Americans are happiest. And here is the answer. So x-axis is the year of the survey, and the y-axis is the average American happiness. So as you can see, 1970s, despite the energy crisis and so forth, they were quite happy. 80s, it went down a little bit. Late 80s, early 90s, it went up. And I was in PhD program from 95 to 2000. And actually, I was looking at the data, and I talked with my advisor. Nothing is happening, just random fluctuation. These, aggregate level happiness doesn't change that much. But then when I looked more recently, it was quite shocking. Of course, we had the Great Recession in 2008, so you see the down. 2010, it's quite a bit down. And although we recovered quite a little bit in 2012 and 2014, still, compared to 1970s and early 90s, Americans are not as happy. So what was the difference? What was better about America in the 1970s and early 1990s? And some people said rock and roll was better in 1970s. I wasn't born at the time, so I don't know. I was in Japan also at the time. But What we thought about, obviously, was income inequality. So here is a plot of household income inequality, Gini coefficient, the higher, the more uneven. Around 1970s, essentially, although the GDP per capita national wealth increased quite a bit, income inequality didn't increase. Namely, everybody benefited from the increase in national wealth. The wealth was redistributed throughout the different walks of life. But as you can see, 1980s, sharp increase. Early 1990s, a little bit stabilized, but then, since then, we see a huge, dramatic increase. So, around 2010, when the Occupy Wall Street movement was very, very hot, we started analyzing these data. The paper we published in 2011 in Psych Science looked at the data up to 2008. So x-axis is just the Gini coefficients, the degree of income inequality. Y-axis is the average happiness of Americans. And as you can see, there is some negative correlation. But what is interesting is not just the average American happiness being sort of inversely correlated with the income inequality. What is interesting to me is when we look at the happiness of poorest 20% and happiness of the richest 20%. So since 1972, we can look at how happy were the poorest 20% of America in 1972, 1973, 1974, and so forth. And what was the happiest level of the richest 20% in 1972, 1973, and so forth. So now I'm slicing the data in terms of the richest 20%, how happy they were as a function of income inequality over time. Zero correlation. So essentially, rich people are happy no matter what. And we just try to look at various social indicators, nothing matters. Nothing matters. In contrast, the next graph is the happiness of the poorest 20% of Americans. The huge inverse correlation. And of course, poorest 20% of Americans' happiness really is closely correlated with the income inequality. When we look at other social indicators, of course, they are correlated. But what is the sort of psychological mechanism? Inequality and unhappiness, it seems obvious, but what we found is that in the year of greater income inequality, essentially the Americans, average Americans, perceived life to be less fair. So here is the negative association, which makes sense, right? The rich are getting richer, so average Americans feel that life is unfair. Less obvious is the trust findings. So in the year of greater income inequality, average Americans did not trust others as much. They thought that other people will take advantage of you. And to the extent that the fairness and trust are positively correlated with happiness, right? When you feel the world is fair, when you feel like you can trust others, you feel happier. So we were able to explain in part the inverse association, the negative association between the income inequality and happiness by looking at the fairness and the trust. Meanwhile, in the epidemiology and elsewhere, there are lots of data suggesting that the income inequality is bad for physical health as well. So it seems like, well, there is fairly reasonable data showing that income inequality is not that great for society at large in terms of physical well-being, psychological well-being, and so forth, especially for the poorest 20%, 40%. So the next question was then, how can we reduce it? And then the obvious place in terms of the societal level issue is the taxation. So more progressive, the taxation is perhaps the smaller the income inequality is, because you're trying to redistribute the wealth from the one generation to the next. And earlier, I looked at actually the degree of progressive taxation and the happiness across 130 nations. And we found that actually progressive taxation was positively correlated with the average happiness of the nations. But it's cross-sectional, there are a lot of problems with that type of data set. So we wanted to look at America. Currently, when we looked at the cross-national findings, the most progressive nation was Sweden. So if you're in the top income bracket, your rate is 55%. You have to pay 55% of income to the federal government. If you're the lowest income bracket, 0%. So the difference is 55%. Very, very progressive. In the United States, the top income bracket, now what, 36, 37%? Lowest, you still have to pay 15%. So the difference of 21, 22% or something like that. But historically speaking, how high do you think American taxation, the progressiveness of taxation was? It's really shocking. In 1970s, the top income bracket and the lowest income bracket, the difference was about 70%. So anyone want to pay 70%? Any of you are in the top income bracket? Probably no, right? From 36% to 70% is too much. But it's interesting that before, in the 1970s at least, the income taxation was much more progressive. And then we looked at essentially tax progressiveness of taxations and income inequality. We did a lot of time lag analysis. And as you can imagine, the more progressive taxation is, the smaller the income inequality is in the subsequent year. And we already know this direction. So we were able to link it up. Psychologically speaking, the progressive taxation tend to be associated with the lower income inequality. The lower income inequality is associated with the greater trust and fairness, and greater trust and fairness is associated with greater happiness. And this path model is really particularly strong for the lowest 20% of, poorest 20% of Americans. So overall, I think we have pretty good data to suggest that income inequality is not that great. Progressive taxation might be a one answer. But why nobody is supporting progressive taxation? Last weekend, I went to Tobin Project near Harvard, and Robert Frank was the panel in my session. And he's been proposing the progressive consumption taxation for the last 10 years, and he was really mad that it's not going anywhere. And then other people are, nobody likes progressive taxation. So the why is that is the question. And then we thought, maybe as a psychologist, I think we have some misunderstanding and misperceptions about the potential effect of progressive taxation. So what we did is to collect new data, asked the average sort of Americans to think about different taxations. So in one society, the richest income bracket people pay 30%, lowest income bracket pay 20%, fairly flat taxation. And in the extreme case, the highest pay 75%, lowest pay 5%. And after training this, what we mean by progressive taxations and different level progressive taxation, we asked, okay, now imagine you are the poorest 20% of this society. How happy or unhappy would you be if you were in this taxation system, in this taxation system, in this taxation system? Okay? And then we used exactly the same scale as the general social survey. So this is the least progressive society taxation. This is the maximum 1970s style taxation. Okay? Americans think that the poorest 20% of Americans would be a lot happier in progressive taxation than flat taxation. Okay? That's not surprising at all. Next, what about the rich one? If you were top 20%, the richest 20% in this society, how happy would you be in this taxation, the very flat taxation, to very, very steep progressive taxation? Almost exact opposite. I would like to draw attention. Actually, one is not at all happy. So we think, most Americans think, that under this most progressive taxation of 1970 style, richest 20% of Americans would be essentially miserable, okay? In terms of the effect size, so poorest 20%, 0.58 correlation between progressiveness of taxations and predicted happiness. For richest 20%, it's minus 0.71, pretty sharp. Luckily, we have actual historical data, so we can test how true they are. For poorest 20%, the actual correlation between the progressiveness of taxations and their actual happiness, 0.43. So our intuition is pretty accurate. Indeed, poorest 20% of Americans are happier in the more progressive system. What about richest 20%? Minus 0.19, zero, like statistically non-significant. So what's happening, seems to me, is that we tend to really overestimate the potentially negative impact of progressive taxation on the rich people. Actually, rich people are fine. I mean, well, I wouldn't be in that bracket, so maybe I'm a little bit irresponsible here, but I think we tend to overestimate. And when we think about, okay, what makes America great, how can we make America great again? Based on these type of data, my suggestion is, what about progressive taxation? So I will end there, and oh, by the way, even the unhappiest year for the richest 20% was 1972, is 2.25. The happiest year for the poorest 20%, 1978, that was about 2.1. So essentially, just the richest American 20% are off the chart happier than the poorest 20%, not just the progressive taxation doesn't matter. Okay, so thank you very much.
Someone get a mic for this question here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I just have a quick question about the data that you were looking at to measure happiness, particularly in your last point. When you said that the rich were just as happy regardless of progressive tax, at least from a statistical significance standpoint, were you looking only at self-report measures of happiness, or were you also looking at measures of fairness and trust, the way you looked at with the other data?
Yeah, so the data I showed you were just a self-reported happiness. But we have the data about the fairness and trust are not really associated with progressive taxations, income inequality among the richest 20%. On the other hand, for the poorest 20%, really very strongly associated with it.
Thank you.
I wonder if the richest people did matter in the end. If most of if in a progressive tax system, your 70% is on your ordinary income and not on your capital. If most of your money is not through ordinary income, but in capital gains, and that doesn't really get taxed much, then it may not really matter that 70% of, maybe my ordinary income is $2 million, but the other way I make my $100 million is taxed at 10%. And so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. So another thing I didn't really go into deeply is that in the 1970s, there were way more brackets, right? So very few people were in the top bracket. Now, the number of brackets was reduced. So it is true. that in the 1970s, only small number of people were affected by this 70% or 75%. Second, of course, we're talking about the income tax, dividend, earnings and so forth have different taxation. So you're absolutely right. Effective taxation is very different. So we have to look at the effective taxation, if possible, in the cross-cultural, cross-national studies that we did in 2012. We were able to do that, but here we weren't quite able to do it. So estate tax change, right? The other investment earning tax change. So it is important, of course, to look at the overall wealth, not just the income and the taxation on the income, earned income, wage versus others as well.
What would you recommend? 70% seems extreme for someone like me on my ordinary income, which is where I make most of my money. So, like, what would you, given your experience and your research, what have you been thinking about?
Yeah, so we are very sensitive to change. So you can't, like, it doesn't work to change it to 70% overnight, obviously. I think it's really more rational to just have more fine, way more brackets. If you want to increase the higher taxing, so that it's people who are making 180 to 100 might not be all of a sudden subject to the 70%, right? Those 40 million, 100 million people might be. So I think the gradual change, as well as a little bit more fine-tuned sort of bracket, old-fashioned 1970s, 1940s style might work better.